Today, we're going to talk about next-gen materials. A lot of you might have heard about plant-based leather, faux fur, but next-gen materials that replace animal-based materials are so much more than that. So today, we're going to find out more. Hi, I'm Elaine Siu, the Chief Innovation Officer at Material Innovation Initiative. Think about what are the traditional animal-based materials. So the main categories really are 6 of them: leather, silk, wool, fur, down, and exotic skins. So those are the animal-based materials that we focus on finding replacements and alternatives for. Millions of tons of these materials are actually used in the fashion industry. So whether it is a leather bag, a silk blouse, down jacket, wool sweater, a pair of high heels or sneakers, they're all made from these animal-based materials. And in the past few years, we've heard more and more of alternatives to these materials. For example, vegan leather and faux fur. And this is one of the biggest trends in textiles and apparels that we see. Well, there is definitely a growing awareness that we need to move away from relying on industrial animal agriculture. And one of the biggest reasons is, of course, the environment, because animal-based materials, or basically anything animal-based, are linked to climate change, chemical waste, and also natural resource depletion. The other obvious issue is animal welfare. There is also public health concerns. Also, at a much higher, broader level, intensive animal agriculture itself is a major driver of antibiotic resistance and creates a breeding ground for future pandemics. The big advances in this space are basically founded in a shift in mindset. So it's basically no longer a niche customer base of people who would call themselves vegans. It is a much bigger awareness and much more mainstream awareness now. So I think with the shift in intention, it means the bar is much higher now for these next-gen materials. They need to be competitive in all the fundamentals. That means performance, aesthetics, price. They need to be able to scale. They also need to be sustainable. So that's a big challenge, and that's where things get really interesting. We're seeing many new companies. So there are close to 100 and growing next-gen material companies now. Innovation and technological breakthrough is at the core of these startups, and many of us have heard about plant-based leather made from grape and apple, etc., right? But there are actually a huge variety of inputs and production method being explored and developed. And it's all interrelated because animals are raised to become inputs into so many different industries. And there was actually a book published a few years ago. It was really interesting. A researcher traced a pig that ended up in 185 products. Just one pig into 185 products in many different industries. So the most obvious one people think about would be food, but definitely there's also fashion, personal hygiene, skincare, medicine, even construction materials. So this will continue to be a very dynamic and interesting space because breakthroughs in another industry will impact that in textiles and apparels and vice versa. When it comes to animal-free alternatives. How do we educate public on technology? I think that's like a huge, broad question. To be very honest, the end consumers, they won't want to get into the nitty-gritty of the science, right? So I think what's then very important is for the brands. They're basically standing between these innovators, these materials, and the end consumers. They're basically the gatekeeper. So it's really up to them to adopt these materials and turn them into the end products for the consumers. It is also a little bit on them really to make that make that an appealing story, obviously based on the facts, but kind of turn it into layman terms, right? So that end consumers would actually understand what these are about. There are a lot of interesting partnerships going on, many brands really. So all these brands have sustainability goals to reach and deadline to actually meet these goals. These goals are publicly disclosed and they are held accountable for them. So how are they going to deliver? But then most of the current gen alternatives don't actually meet those sustainability standards yet. And whereas startups and innovators are coming up with interesting and exciting materials, their vision and technology are future focused and trend setting, really. So it makes a lot of sense for established brands to want to work with them. One of the big gap is time for R&D. But then I think the most exciting thing is to see the funding that's going into this space. Because honestly, what's required to accelerate the growth and scale up of next-gen materials is basically money and talent. And we are really seeing both flowing into this new industry. 2.3 billion has been invested since 2015. And quite surprisingly, last year's monies raised by these next-gen material companies doubled what was raised in 2020. And so that's a 100% growth, and that's despite the pandemic. So yeah, to fill that gap, I think the most important thing is that more and more stakeholders are getting onto the same page regarding what has to be done to solve this sustainability crisis upon us. Because really, it's not about one technology breakthrough, about one startup or one brand doing something. It is a collective effort. Looking into the future, given all that I've already mentioned, I think there are so many signs that are really encouraging that this space will continue to grow bigger and faster. And we actually need it to grow bigger and faster because of the sustainability crisis upon us. We're already seeing some companies, for instance, in alternative proteins, now also venturing into next-gen materials. Because when you're actually reinventing and reimagining at a very basic stage, which is growing protein, how do we grow protein and produce protein differently? It can be applied in so many different industries. This is a much bigger picture and trend, and every little parts of it would actually affect each other and hopefully help each other grow in a healthier way.